Welcome everyone who's managed to join us already. Welcome to the second webinar in the webinar series entitled Blended Voices, Building an Understanding of Torture, War Trauma and Violence Through an African Lens. My name is Stephen Rabello from the Center for the Study of Violence and Reconciliation, and I'm part of the research team. The focus of today's symposium or webinar series is focusing on repetition. And the title of today's webinar, or the focus is really looking at an analysis of repetition of trauma across time and asks, is violence inevitable and repetition a compulsion? Just to let you know that in terms of interpretation, we have 3 languages available today. We have French, if you would like to listen to today's presentations in French. We have Amharic, which is available on the Arabic channel. And as I mentioned, we're still working on Swahili. So just to let you know in terms of how this webinar series came about, obviously due to COVID, I think it really created the opportunity to extend the reach of this webinar series. And we started planning as the CSVR, we started planning this webinar series last year. And as part of the webinar series, we had an open abstract submission process where anyone who received the invites to the webinar series, anyone was able to submit an abstract to present at this webinar series. And so we hoped to select a diverse number of presentations focusing on the 5 themes that we have as part of this symposium series. And at the same time, we know that unfortunately it's not always easy to have presentations that are fully representative of the countries that are represented here and to those who are joining us. But we do hope that the information that's shared through these presentations can be applicable and that it can be relatable to people across the continent. We also have, we will be on Facebook and on Twitter. And if you are using Twitter, we ask if you can use the hashtags towards healing Africa is our first hashtag, and the second hashtag is MHPSS in Africa. So if you are on Twitter, please help us out and spread those hashtags, and please share on Facebook and also retweet on Twitter as well.
The word trauma is derived from the Greek language and literally means injury, damage caused by external violence. More commonly, the term is used to refer to shocking events that are traumatic, wounding in nature. Events such as war, domestic violence, protest violence, xenophobia, racism, torture, political and state violence can be viewed as traumatic, giving rise to intense and overwhelming emotions of fear, dread, powerlessness, anger, and panic. The wounding of trauma is a complicated phenomenon, as it seeps into our being and has the potential to transcend us, even when we have left the earth, reliving in our future generations. This is noted in our history and the stories we tell. As we tell them, it is the ghosts of the past that speak to us, triggering memories of the past, whispering to us, this has happened before. The face of violence, the face of trauma, its expressions may have changed, but yet it is still so familiar. In the present, we watch events unfold in front of us and recall them being told to us by our elders, or not told, but felt, as silence itself has a loud voice. Trauma travels through generations, noted through the continued use of violence as an expression of power in families, communities, and at state level. The lack of empathy for the other, distrust and fear, and the othering that continues to take place amongst people, racial, tribal, political, gender. Trauma fragments the social fabric of societies, as the trauma memories of the past live within us, embedded in our individual and collective psyches. Unprocessed, they lay dormant. Triggered, they give rise to the ghosts of the past. Psychoanalyst Hans Loerwald said, "Those who know ghosts tell us that they long to be released from their ghost life and laid to rest as ancestors. As ancestors, they live forth in the present generation, while as ghosts they are compelled to haunt the present generation with their shadow life." The reenactment of past traumas can be seen across time, evident in the perpetration of violence in Congolese political regimes over decades, Zimbabwe's years of dictatorship rule, ongoing conflict in Sudan, modern-day slavery in the form of human trafficking in Libya, and in South Africa, where we have witnessed the repetition of the past in triggering memories of students attacked by armed forces in the Fees Must Fall movement in 2017, which bore a scarring resemblance to images captured during the student uprising in 1976. Sandra Bloom says that if trauma remains untreated, if the wounding is untransformed, then history will keep on repeating itself, and every time it does, the cost is higher. The present continues to mimic the past, and we wonder, is violence inevitable and repetition a compulsion? Why is this repetition called for? What does it ask of us? And how better can we respond?
Thanks to Sumaya for sharing that video with us, which gives a good overview of what today's symposium or webinar is focusing on. Getting straight into the presentations that we have today. Our first presenter is Tenjiwe Mzwane, and Tenjiwe is a full-time parent who has to prepare her for a 10-year-old social distance birthday party, which is happening quite soon on the 29th of November. She is yet to order a cake because she is spending all of her time being a PhD candidate at the University of the Witwatersrand with the SWAP, which is the States of Violence Research Cohort instead. Her PhD is interested in gender, sexuality, migration, and the mimicking of masculine violences in post-colonial migrant cities. Tenjiwe's presentation today is entitled Relieving or Reliving Trauma Generational Scars of Activism or Activisms. Tenjiwe, over to you. Tenjiwe, can you hear us?
Yes, I can. Thank you, Stephen. Let me just, my connection is a bit slow. Hi, can everybody hear me?
Yeah, go ahead.
All right, sure. So my thinking and my thoughts are intro to the video that we just saw. Thank you for that, Samir. Is in ideas of collective healing, the people who are disrupting the systems that oppress. So I'm interested in how activism and activisms relive trauma intergenerationally. But in particular for this, I'm interested in the ways in which trauma is remembered through what I call, or what is called, works of memory. So I start off in my presentation what activism is, and it's the intentional actions to bring about social change, and include things like protest, resistance, revolt, and disruptions. What's interesting for me about activism is that in and of themselves, activisms are interested in bringing about a massive social change, but the social change that they're working against is bigger than them. So the people who are involved in activisms are activists, and these are individual people whose lifespans are short. I think that's one of the things that's interesting for me about intergenerational trauma, that the lifespans are short versus this massive social order it is that you're working with. So here we're met by the actions of human beings trying to be capacitated with methods of disrupting, protesting against massive oppressions, right? So what then interests me is the ways in which we know, and we'll always know, that no massive social order will ever be at peace with just being overturned by small groups or by large groups. But what's more interesting to me is the ways in which this becomes mimicked in youth group and in student groups. So I continue to speak about how the structures that these collectives of activists, these people trying to bring about intentional action, are met by such as policing, and inequality, which is bigger and older than them. So for example, in a capitalist society where you're trying to fight an issue of unequal education in schools, and you're met by massive policing and guns and grenades, that type of physical violence, already you're aware of the fact that this has more power than you have. So the collective is already aware that these people have more power than they have because they've had a longer time to keep working at oppression. So that's the first thing that I'm interested in. And then what this then power, although, so I say in parts of my presentation, although there's this, there's the idea that activists and people activating say of no retreat, no surrender, the amount of power in which you're fighting versus the amount of power that you have in your human body and your capability of getting tired and wanting to be hungry and wanting rest, is there is an inevitable retreat and a surrender. And in that retreat and the surrender, what happens to movements and activist groups, and I'm going to show this when I speak about the examples of, for example, Egypt, and the examples of in South Africa. We'll look at a thread from 1972 and then Marikana. There is an evident surrender because people, you cannot not surrender to guns when you do not have them. Yes, in a couple of years, and we'll see in how activism rebuilds again, is that there's sometimes a new generation. Other times it's the same people continuing the fight, but often there's a new people coming in to try and continue the resistance. What I'm interested in the work, and I think in psychology and in the work of institutions such as CSVR, maybe there's more work around the healing, psychosocial healing, but I, as trained in anthropology and currently studying violence, is that sometimes and often violence is understood as a method of order, especially post-wars. So after this massive violent war, the order is structured, and there's a lot of violence studies that goes into that. What I'm interested in is in smaller institutions. So for example, institutions such as higher learning institutions or high school, where there isn't a massive change that happened, there isn't a massive war, there's just a continuation, sometimes a forgetting and then a re-remembering, but there isn't a war that changes everything and restructures, and therefore allows for things like, for example, a TRC and meetings of all the entities to rebuild. So it is just a continuation from the previous instead of a pause. And so then that violence doesn't necessarily recreate order, it just brings about trauma. And I mean, of course, all violence brings about trauma, but violence scholars will study and have studied that often with conflict, violence is understood as bringing order. So what intergenerational trauma is then understood as I look at the work of Kim and Kim, and there's obviously other authors in South Africa, for example, we look at this one of the scholars also at the Vis Anthropology Department, Erasmus, who does a lot of work about intergenerational trauma in South Africa. And so she traces from the 1950s and the revolt of the migrant city of Johannesburg and violences that have happened since, and also using the work of Melusi Langa. But Kim follows the thread of, so the sort of foundational ideas around intergenerational trauma is around the biological. So the biological carrying and the passing down of trauma. So for example, from mothers to children, in that sort of genetic can be traced type of trauma. What I'm interested in and what this presentation is interested in is in when the trauma is reenacted and is reperformed within similar spaces. So then in the presentation, I look at Egypt, for example. So if you look at Egypt in 2011, we know that by the time that the ousting of, I don't want to mispronounce names, but of the then leader, by the time that had happened, that had followed years of social activisms. And what had been happening to these activists throughout those times is that we know that policing comes in, militarization comes in, groups disappear for a little bit of time, and then groups re-emerge until there's a particular date. For example, so in Egypt, the date is January. And then, so we also know that in Brazil, after years of student protests in 2016, students shut down over 108 schools. But before that, we know that there's been police brutality, there's been the bringing of militarization, and we see also the same thing in South Africa. So for me in particular, and because I am a violence scholar in South Africa, what interests me, and it's the same for the previous two countries and the next country, that there isn't 4 or 5 generations later where we see the same type of performance. So what was interesting to me about the protests of Fees Must Fall in South Africa, there's a poster that became really popular, which was quoting Dessalines of Haiti in 1804. And the quote said something about, it said, bomba, and what it translated to was something around the lines of, we swear to destroy the whites and all they possess. And this was such an interesting passing down of it. So that is a knowledge that's been passed down, but it's not the first time that, because when we see words like we cannot breathe, we see words like the words of Fanon that keep on being passed down through the works of memory, through storytelling, through the ways in which people resist. And then by the time that the protests of 2016 happened, we had already seen a police brutality around workers in Marikana. And it is that there is never a time for there to be a forgetting of the trauma. It is that there's a few years in which, or in particular countries, there will be a decade or two where the violence or the activism rather disappears, but it is rebuilt within people who can exist in the same time period. So for me, I'm not just interested in the activism in the trauma that's passed down through biology, but I'm interested in the trauma that's then passed down, and how is it that in 2015 people are saying the same thing that was said in 1804, the same thing that has been said by your Marcus Garveys and your Martin Luther Kings, and in different types of protests across the world, even though and so we know then, or I assume that if we're aware that social change is not an overall upheaval, so it's not a once-off process where it changes, what of the traumas that happen in between? What happens of the memories of police violence and brutality? We also have the example of India. And in India, we see, again, also in the student movement in the 1960s and the 1970s, students in universities in India take up protests, and then in a very similar, and then in 1974, there was statewide protest, which led to a curfew in 44 towns in India. And then again in 2016, we see a very similar rise of protest, and the duration between those is, So 30, an average of 25 to 30 years, almost in all of these instances. And so these two generations are living, and sometimes even three generations live amongst and within each other. And they're passing down stories of trauma and then memories of trauma and then reliving similar traumas over and over again before it has even passed down to a biological. We know that they are in this position, of course, because of the ways in the systems of oppression have continued to oppress them. But it is, for me, what is of interest is how it is passed down in the time that everybody is living together, and then it's mimicked in very similar ways. I always find it interesting how protests often happen in the same way and has been happening in the same way for the very longest time. We see it in protests in South Africa now, that the resistance is still the same. It's stun grenades, it's police brutality, and over and over and over again, it's the same thing. And I'm interested in the work of healing. When do we heal these moments of violences? And so I say, this presentation attempts in parts to show the evidence of passing down, and not just passing down biologically, but passing down through memory, the traumas of activisms, the traumas of intentionally trying to bring down or to bring about a social change. So in protest, action, demonstration, activism continues and repeats itself every few decades or over decades or for long periods of time, in a time when we're aware that activisms are met with violences. So internal violences, for example, state violence, external, sorry, so state violences, but internal violences. We know that within movements and movement building and activisms, that there's always been contestations, but there's always the rebuilding. So the work of focusing again on taking down the bigger social change without healing the traumas that are happening. So I'm interested in, given that we know that trauma keeps getting passed down, given that we know that this is how the state is going to respond, and here are the things that happen in moments of activism, when and how will there, and when, more than anything, will there be spaces of healing the traumas collectively as well, because these violations happen in collective groups. So if it's 1 million people marching through India in 1 year for a particular cause, and 1 million people are getting stun grenaded, I don't know who, and I assume maybe it's civil society, because I know the academy never will, because violence funds the work that we're able to continue doing. But what is the work when everybody is funding the work of activism, when everybody's really proud, and it's a good thing that things like NSARS happen and all of these protests happen, but what does the work of collective healing look like, given that we know that we keep passing down traumas? Thank you, Stephen.
Did I catch you right at the end?
Yeah.
Thanks, Tanjira. Thank you for your presentation, and yeah, very well done in terms of time as well. Our next presentation is Jada Haji, and Jada is an international master's student in psychology at the University of the Witwatersrand. She is French and Moroccan, and previously studied a B.Psych at the University of Paris, and a B.Ed Honours and M.Ed in Inclusive Education at the University of the Witwatersrand. Her interests are on critical perspectives, decolonialization studies, identity construction, and social justice. Her ambition is to make a difference towards social justice through the mind and body in terms of praxis. Indeed, in parallel with her studies and research, she teaches children who may struggle at school. She also previously participated in an international conference on disability organized by the Wits Center for Diversity Studies. Jada's presentation is entitled Love, Utando, A Way for a Long Walk to Freedom. Jada, over to you.
Thank you. Okay. So good afternoon, everyone. Here we go. So what I will present you today is based on my master research that took place last year. The title of the research was Love/Utando, which means love in Zulu, a way for a long walk to freedom. We see the reference to Mandela. But today I reshaped the title because I will focus mostly on the question of violence and love in relation to trauma. So as we all know, the apartheid system was based on negative and violent social interactions based on race and class. Black men and women were violently discriminated in terms of race and class. In terms of race and class, and deprived from freedom in terms of consciousness, which in turn affect their emotional well-being. So consciousness, our thinking and our emotion, this is what makes us human. So they were actually deprived from a certain humanity. Sorry, because I don't see my whole screen, I just need to, okay. Today we can talk about a dehumanizing historical trauma in terms of racial prejudice and poverty that is maintained by the system, that is still maintained today by the system since apartheid, because we all know that today in South Africa, the population that is the most discriminated are black people. I mean, if we talk at the national level, because if we focus, if we look at Cape Town, it's also the colored community. But anyway, this was just a bit in brackets. So how can Black working class men and women reach freedom in terms of consciousness and well-being? So in my research, this is how I define freedom in terms of consciousness and well-being, which makes us human. So if both trauma of racial prejudice and poverty are based on social interactions, because it was implemented during apartheid through social interactions. So if these trauma were constructed through social interactions, it means that the solution may be also found through social interactions. Okay, so I will focus on 3 topics. Firstly, on the theory of Fanon and Frère, which is endogenous knowledge. The endogenous knowledge is a written knowledge from the South about the South. Secondly, I will focus on the participants' knowledge, or the indigenous knowledge, which is a oral knowledge, not the written one, but the oral knowledge about the South and from the South. And thirdly, I will try to give you an answer to this question: what type of social interactions can lead to freedom, consciousness, and emotional well-being? Violent or loving social interactions, or maybe both? So the question of violence. Fanon says, in reality, what is this violence? We saw it. It's the feeling of the colonized community that their freedom has to be reached through the force. But he also says, colonialism is not a thinking machine. It's not a body proficient in reasoning. Colonialism is violence per se and will only submit to bigger violence. So here, on the one hand, Fanon says that the colonized communities may need to use force to become free. And at the same time, he says that colonialism, which is violence, does not lead to reasoning, to consciousness, which is, I mean, reasoning, we can consider it as a synonym of consciousness. So if violence doesn't lead to consciousness, which in turn lead to emotional well-being, it means that it doesn't lead to freedom. And indeed, Paulo Freire says, the dominant elites use all means, including physical violence, to keep the people from thinking. So there is no way that we reach freedom in terms of consciousness and emotional well-being through violence. But then why violence? Why is it still happening? As Tenji Wei said just before, violence still happens through the years, from like how we can't get rid of it. What does it bring? And Fanon explains that violence detoxifies. Sorry, I don't see the wall. Violence detoxifies it, I don't see it, the colonized to get rid of the inferiority complex. So what we can understand, what I understand here is that violence brings a nice feeling. And I think it's because of the identity change. By being violent, we are not the inferior anymore. We become the superior. So we change our identity from the inferior to the superior, because we are all taken into this dynamic of inferiority versus superiority. And violence brings this good feeling in the moment of the violence. It's really a good feeling in the short term, but it doesn't fix anything. It doesn't lead to freedom. Okay. So now the question of love. So the solution for Fanon is self-assertion, self-acceptance, or what I call self-love. He says that we need to love ourselves in order to address our trauma. But to love our identity, to love who we are, we need the other, because we know today in psychology that the identity construction process depends on the other. We all depend on each other regarding our identity. For example, I'm brown or I'm black because you are white. We all depend on each other to construct our identity. We define ourselves as much as the other define us. Which means that if we need to love ourselves, we need the help of the other. We need the other to recognize and to love us, to help us to love ourselves. And we can't just do that, because this will be very self-centered. We need to do it for our community. So in turn, we also need to love the other, to help the other to love themselves. And this is how we can break the pathological dynamic of inferiority versus superiority, which was constructed during colonization. So how can we, we depend on each other. We need to show each other love in order to love ourselves and reach consciousness and emotional well-being. But how can we show love to each other? How does it work concretely? So Fanon says, being heard rather than speaking means fully existing for the other. And I don't see the whole citation of Paulo Freire, but you see it. If I do not love, anyway, the only thing I see, well, anyway, you can read the citation of Paulo Freire. I don't see it on my screen now. But as you can see, he says that to love the other, to love people, to love life, we need to enter into dialogue. So they are both saying the same thing. In order to show each other love, in order to fully exist, to become fully human, and to address our trauma and others' trauma, we need to listen to each other. We need to be listened and listen. We need to hear the other's voice and be heard. Okay. In other words, we cannot become fully human or free through violence. It will not lead to consciousness and emotional well-being, but it will just bring this nice feeling in the moment, because we will change our identity and feel in the other side of the dynamic, which is like the superior side. In opposition, love or loving social interactions may lead to consciousness and by extension, emotional well-being through dialogue. And through dialogue, we may address historical trauma and undertake productive actions. Through dialogue, we learn to love each other, to love ourselves, address our trauma, reach a certain consciousness, and by extension, an emotional well-being, and become more active or activists, like Tenjiwe talked just before, and make a difference. Now, the indigenous knowledge. So who are the participants? So I will tell you their story. So the participants work in the University of the Witwatersrand amongst the service staff. And a few years ago, the university decided to outsource them. which means that they decided to call upon an external company to hire them for financial reasons. So like that, it was cheaper. And the workers lost all the benefits. For example, one benefit was that their children could study at the university for free. And it was a very, very negative experience for them, so much that some of them told me that they went for counseling sessions for free that was offered by the university, in the university. So we can see that this outsource process really impacted them, and actually in two ways. Because of the outsourced process, their salary decreased, and the communication was cut because now the outsourced, the external company was the intermediary between the university and them. And then the fees must fall happened. And they decided to join the student and protest. And they were all protesting. I mean, they were protesting in solidarity with the students and the student protesting in solidarity with the staff. And they did it. Today they are insourced. Their salary increased. They have direct communication with the university, which gives more space to dialogue. And yeah, so, and it really affected them positively. And so because of their experience, I wanted to interview them because I could learn so much from what they experience. And here I will highlight 3 things that they explained to me. So they said that there is a contrast between negative and positive social interactions. Positive social interaction lead to emotional, but even economic well-being, which I didn't talk about in the theory. While negative social interactions leads to economic and emotional struggle. They also said that people's differences are the reason why social interactions are difficult and can be negative. And in South Africa, the differences is mostly about race and class. And thirdly, they also explain that the notion of honest dialogue, not just a dialogue, a honest dialogue seems to be significant in turning social interactions from negative to positive, in opposition to a fake dialogue. And they explain the fake dialogue by saying that people are pretending to be this and that, or people are promising things that they will not do, etc. And this kind of dialogue leads to unconsciousness, confusion, and negative interactions. While a honest dialogue leads to consciousness and positive interactions. So like positive and honest dialogue leads to this cycle that I showed earlier that helped each other to love ourselves and address our trauma. So here I wanted to show you and make you hear their voice. And I think that they explain better than me what is a honest dialogue and the connection with emotional well-being. So firstly, Precious, by talking about the outsourcing process, she said, we were stuck. I remember that time I was so angry, like I was having nerves. It was very deep for them. And it actually looked like it reactivated their historical trauma because they became their historical trauma of poverty and racial prejudice because they became poorer, they had lower salary, and racial prejudice, they are all Black, so they feel like it's them again. And it was very intense. Now, the importance of honest dialogue. So I can't see all the, once again, but okay. Siabanga says, myself, I think we should talk. I'm sorry, I don't see all the sayings, so I will leave you with them because I can't see them. And I will explain to you. So through what Siabanga says, we all need to be trustworthy. So we need to be honest with each other. Through what Yolena says, she shows that we need to be equal. And this is the main characteristic of dialogue. We need to be equal. We need to listen and be listened. We need to hear and be heard. And just after saying that, Yolena says, so it gives me courage. And we can see here the connection between a dialogue, honest dialogue, and emotional well-being. Bandile also said, you can even have that courage, that energy to wake up every day. We can achieve what we want. Lisalo said, I'm so happy, I'm so happy. Empo said, that's why the life is better. So we can see here the impact on their emotional well-being. In other words, a honest dialogue may lead to consciousness and in turn emotional and even financial well-being. A fake dialogue or an unequal exchange may lead to confusion, financial and emotional struggle. The conclusion. So now, what type of social interactions can lead to freedom, consciousness and emotional well-being, and even financial well-being? So we all understood that now, loving social interactions may affect one's level of consciousness, emotional and financial well-being, and in turn address both trauma, historical trauma, of racial prejudice and poverty. But violent social interactions can and will happen anyway when facing one's differences. Since some people are and will be taken into dehumanizing pathologic social dynamics of inferiority versus superiority. And they will need to feel, even though it's just in the moment, it brings a good feeling. So it all depends on us to open and construct a honest dialogue as soon as possible in order to avoid violence. Actually, I will not say avoid violence because we will always face violence, I believe, but at least to moderate violence and make it less harmful for our own and one's freedom. Thank you, and Seyabonga, which means thank you in Zulu.
Thank you very much, Jada. Our third presentation today is by Bonolo Lesufi. And Bonola is a registered counselor or registered counseling psychologist who graduated from the University of the Witwatersrand. She also holds a second master's degree in the social sciences, also from WITS. Her research interests include issues of identity, identity politics, race, and class. Her research paper is particularly focused on the racial and cultural experiences of Somali Muslim women residing in Mayfair, Johannesburg. The title of her presentation is Racialized and Cultural Experiences of Muslim Somali Refugee Women Within an Inner City Johannesburg Islam Community. Bonola, over to you.
Okay, afternoon, everyone. Let me just get my screen on. Ooh. Apologies. Can't seem to find my presentation, just one sec. Can anyone see that?
Yeah, we can.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so let's go right into it. All animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others. This well-known quote from the fictional book Animal Farm sets the tone for some of the central themes of this research, which was particularly interested in the racialized and cultural experiences of Muslim Somali refugee women. Although this quote seems quite contradictory, it is compelling in that it addresses pertinent social issues of the day. This statement reveals the hypocrisy and illusion of equality. It highlights the hierarchies in society that categorize people in terms of their social status. In principle, all people should be equal, but in reality, their race, gender, class, age, nationality, religion, and culture serve as critical sources of disadvantage, discrimination, and oppression. This is no different for the participants in this specific study. It could be argued that the animal analogy accurately reveals the inequalities and dehumanization that many migrants are subjected to, where they too are relegated to the status of animals and denied their dignity and humanity. So this paper is really interested in exploring the experiences of Muslim Somali refugee women, which are shaped not by just one dimension of their identity, such as nationality, but really is intertwined and entangled with other identities, such as race, class, gender, religion, and culture. In these ways, it's from these ways that refugee women know how to occupy and navigate the spaces that they're within, not only within their communities, but also beyond their communities. So an intersectional framework was used when conducting this study. It's also a qualitative research methodology which was used and really focuses on IPA to really get more of a richer quality of data. So some information about our participants. They consisted of seven females from Somalia who migrated to South Africa seeking asylum due to the political unrest in their home country. The sample included participants from diverse ethnic groups within the Somali community, and who are all currently residing in the Mayfair/Fortsburg area in Johannesburg. Their age ranges from 18 to 65 years old, and in regards to the data collection, a translator was used in order to bridge the language barriers. So under the apartheid government, Islam was considered an Indian religion and therefore un-African and not for Black people. Some theorists argue that African Muslims contend with having to prove their authenticity as real Muslims, primarily because Islam has been traditionally perceived as an Indian religion. So this suggests that their presence in predominantly Islamic communities within South Africa continues to be questioned, contested, and in some instances, rejected. Another theorist contests the idea of a concrete and unified Muslim identity that eclipses race, class, ethnicity, and nationality. Muslims are differentiated along the lines of race, class, nationality, and gender. Vadwa argues that these are important factors to be cognizant of as they structure and inform the kinds of interactions African Muslims have with South African Muslims of Indian descent. Saudani, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, explains that racialization and ethnicization among South African Muslims is still prevalent today, and that Somali Muslims have been ensnared in some of these divisions. So what this really illustrates is that the ethno-national cleavages indeed continue to prevail over a universal Muslim identity. So while African Muslims have succeeded at claiming their presence in certain spaces and have formed networks of solidarity, they are still considered as the other within the South African social landscape and perhaps within their own communities. The research indicates that Somali refugees have accused Indian Muslims of being racist and showing preferential treatment and bias towards Algerians and Tunisians seeking aid and help. It is crucial to note that both Algerians and Tunisians are light in complexion and that their roots can be traced back to some Arabic or French colonial heritage or ancestry. And this is really the main contention of Black foreign Muslims. In this paper, a distinction is made between South African Indian Muslims and African Muslims. The latter refers to Africans from predominantly Muslim countries in other parts of the continent. This distinction is merely used to indicate country of origin and geographical locations. This does not suggest that Indians who reside in South Africa are in any way not African or that they don't identify as such. So for the basis of this paper, the terms Black foreign nationals as well as African Muslims will be used interchangeably. So that takes us to our first theme. There are two major themes that I'll be presenting on. The first one is race matters. The findings suggest that there seems to be hypervigilance and awareness of the invisible boundaries that exist between Black and Indian people. Ahmed argues that race influences and to a very large degree dictates how Black people utilize their space in everyday life. So participant one says, this one time I went to KFC with my baby, and these Indians, when I greeted them, I said hello. They didn't say anything. Then I sit next to them because that was the only place I could sit. And they said, sis, couldn't you find another place to sit? And I look at them and I said, because they are old people, I felt like crying. Then the old people at reception look at me and they start laughing. I feel so bad, but what can you do? Even if you went to a shop by the Indians, they will close their nose when they see you. It's paining. This participant chronicles a painful story of being undermined in her own community and provides some insight about the divide between Black foreign nationals and Indian people in the Mayfair area, despite a shared religious identity. This participant is shunned by the Indian people in her community and was publicly humiliated because of how she looks and because of her race that she embodies and her nationality. She was made to feel unwanted and unwelcomed in that public space. Vahed and Jeppy argue that race relations between Black foreign nationals and Indian South African people in Johannesburg is contentious, with African Muslims feeling alienated, rejected, and sometimes hated by Indian people. I'm living behind an Indian, and Indians never provided for anyone. If I want a hot or cold water, I ask her. She said, don't ever come to my house. They will treat you like you are not human. I do not pay rent, and this morning we had an argument, and I will go ask for charity. Even if we are all Muslim, they do not see us as human. Participant 6 emphasizes dehumanization, suggesting that those around her view her as primitive and inferior, overlooking their religious affiliation, which should symbolize belonging. Participants were asked to reflect on some of the interactions within their community between Black and Indian people. They explained that interactions between Indian and Black foreign nationals are rare or forced, such as during the exchange of donations or goods, and that casual socializing between the races is an uncommon practice. The participants described some Indians as unaccommodating and harsh. Some also indicated that their children are discouraged from playing with Indian children, and in so doing are socialized into the culture of racism and maintaining boundaries of separateness. They're not friendly and they're distant and they mingle with themselves. Like if you're walking down an aisle and an Indian passes you by, they won't ask you, are you okay or where are you going? Like they distance themselves from us and like we are some kind of a disease. They're not very community-based. I don't know if it is racist or what, because the Somali kids have their own madrasa, the Indian kids have their own, and if you take your kids there, they will look at you weird, says participant 1. Participant 4 says, the Indians in this country, we have a lot of problems. They do not show us any humanity or any Islamic in any way. Even forget about being friendly or ask how you are, or even to greet us is too much for them. They have a lot of hatred for us. They won't even allow any Indian child to play with a Somali child, and they look at us weird. There is a lot of racism, and they are even showing the children. To this, participant 2 adds, you know, one day my little girl was playing outside with an Indian girl. I think she was 3, and the mother of the child came out and said, who told you to play with this baby? And I was standing there and I felt like crying, but what can you do? I took my baby and left, and now I even avoid them. The participants describe overt and covert racism in their everyday experiences. Participant 1, my apologies. Participant 1 uses a metaphor of a disease to illustrate how she feels like some kind of abnormality or plague or even a contagious growth within her community. Distance and isolation are emphasized in each of the extracts, with one participant stating that she uses avoidance as a way of coping. There is also a deep concern and sorrow about how their children are being discriminated against and how they're unable to shield them from racism and racial prejudice, which exacerbates any existing feelings of helplessness. Vahed and Jeppy's research indicates that Somali refugees experience Indians as racist and prejudiced towards them, and this ongoing tension builds from a lack of perceived financial and social assistance from Indian Muslims within that community. Here's an example. Participant 3 says, before they help us, the Indian people and the Muslim people, like stationery and rent, but they stop everything. It's not much like before. They don't think of you as a community. No, they just come for Ramadan. The Indian man next door won't greet you when you greet him. He won't say anything. Sometimes the Indians will make donations, and sometimes he will give you small amounts, and sometimes they never do. Sometimes he can tell you that they cannot help you, says participant 7. These accounts challenge ideas about Muslim universalism. The accounts from the majority of participants in this study contest this portrayal of the Indian community as custodians for Somalis and convey significant differences in their racialized everyday experiences. While the participants admitted that some instances of kindness and support are prevalent from the Indian community, all were in unison that there are underlying racial undertones and microaggressions experienced regularly. Participant 2, who gives an account of discrimination she encountered in the shopping mall, gives greater insight into this. Yesterday, we went to a shop just to check things, and they didn't even get up and help us. But a white lady comes in and they ask, "What would you like?" I just wanted to leave. And my sister said, "No, we should look." I said, "No, I don't want to be here." Then immediately it was painful. How do they know I don't have money? When the ladies come in, they stand up quickly. They stand up really quickly. I'm getting angry. I don't want to be in a shop where they are racist and where they treat us like we are nobodies. This brings me to my second theme, internal ethnic divisions. The common thread among the participants is a sense of loss of community, not only between Indian and Black migrants, but also among one another as Black migrants from different parts of Africa. Participants alluded to internal racial racism, not only between the tribes, but also within the Somali tribes. When I left Somalia because of the tribe issue, most of us are still a community. And so whatever happens with us, you don't go to another tribe. We are eating each other, even in another country. Even if they see two tribes, they will intimidate you. There is a racism within us, says participant 5. Even as Somalis fight, even among us, there is racism among us. This is further explained by participant 1, who says, most of the Indians here are not friendly with us, and the Ethiopians and Somalia do not mingle with one another. So most of the participants highlight tribalism and internal racism as having an impact on their social interactions and restricting their movement in some spaces. Tribalism can be understood as a state of group consciousness that generates a sense of belonging and fosters loyalty between group members. So the experiences of the participants all emphasize the great significance of one's tribe, even post-resettlement. This speaks to the transfer of culture across borders and denotes the many ways in which Somali migrants' current realities in South Africa seems to be an extension of the lives that they led in Somalia. I couldn't work because my job is to carry the weight of my flasks. I didn't have anyone to help me. I was lying for 4 days alone. There is no tribe or any people who come and stand up to me. The guy who assaulted me is part of a tribe in Somalia who are causing havoc, so nobody stood up for me, says participant 4. I'm a mom of 2 kids. Because I was married to a tribe that my family never wanted, and no Somalis get married to them, but I got married to him, and we got married, fell in love, came to Johannesburg. I wonder when my kids grow up, how are they going to feel because I am disgusting, because no one gets married to that tribe in Somalia. It's the lowest tribe. I don't know if you have that in SA. I was even scared to take my kids to madrasa, says participant 1. So intermarrying into certain tribes is heavily contested, and disloyalty to one's tribe leads to not only shame to the perpetrator, but also to his or her immediate family members and other tribe members. So taking this into account, it can be presumed that participant 1 is not only concerned about how her children will perceive her and how they will rationalize the decisions that she chose to make, but her concern may be centered upon whether her children will be punished for her own decision to marry outside of the tribe. It is these ethnic divisions that present a complex web of confusion interwoven in the politics of belonging, as well as collectivist and individualistic practices. And this seems to be an internal battle that a lot of the women in this study have to navigate on a daily basis. So in conclusion, on entering South Africa, Somali women have to contend with multiple identities that include that of being a foreigner. While the Mayfair and Fortsburg community may provide a sense of belonging and allow for the preservation of both a cultural and religious identity for these displaced groups of people, this does not necessarily imply that this area is conceptualized as home by Somali women. The length of time spent residing in Johannesburg does not necessarily translate into emotional feelings of belonging. Sardounet supports this view and states that most refugees living in Mayfair do not feel or recognize the area as one where they fit in or belong, despite having lived there for several years. The participants shed light on the internal ethnic fractures that exist among Somalis, such as class differences, as well as tribal conflicts, which contribute to further divisions in the spaces that they occupy. The feeling of being foreigner is thus pervasive and prevalent within and beyond their immediate community. Furthermore, the lives of Somali Muslim women are constructed against a backdrop of continuous and significant discrimination. In the quest of forging a new life and identity in their host countries, they continue to experience perpetual trauma, and their suffering appears to present itself on an unending continuum. This is exacerbated by a sense of disillusionment expressed by the participants, as it seems that their expectations of South Africa and the life they imagined they would have are in many ways shattered. So it poses the question, is violence, even subtle violence, simply a way of life for these women? Thank you. And also just a special thanks to CSVR for assisting with this research. Thank you so much. Over to you, Stephen.
Thanks so much, Fernanda. Thanks for your presentation. Thanks to everyone else who has also been posing some questions and comments to the presenters. And I can ask the presenters if you can also just check the Q&A section, and you can perhaps get a sense of some of the questions and comments that have come through. The first question that we have here, I think, is posed to both Tenjue and Jada. And this question asks, we know that trauma hampers our ability to empathize with the other because you're often in survival mode. What does this mean in a continent suffering in terms of collective trauma, in terms of developing self-love and thus freedom? If it is dependent on the other and the other's needs to see us and our value and worth, which essentially requires empathy. So I think essentially the question is asking about trauma. How does this influence our ability to empathize? How does, in the context of Africa, where we have a great deal of collective trauma, how does that influence our ability to empathize and to see the other? Tenjue and to Jada, either of you can go first.
You can go, Tenjue.
Sure. Okay. Hi, Sumaya. So Sophia asked the question. So I don't know whether, sorry, my child is, I don't know whether I So I'm interested in that activism in and of itself is an attempt to work against things like people not seeing each other. What's interesting to me, so I don't know whether we need to see each other, or what's interesting to me and why I'm interested in activism and living trauma is that clearly there seems to be a disjuncture, especially when it comes to internal violences between activist groups. Because so if we look at our second presentation, which focused on self-love, and if conscientization is that, the trauma that comes from the internal activism, but the lack of an attempt at healing the trauma for me is part of how the activism itself is not the final solution to violences. I think that's essentially what I'm trying to suggest, in that in the ways in which violence is, or in the ways in which the violences that we experience from the external are so powerful in terms of the state's funding that, in terms of it being systems of years and years and years. I seem to, and I believe I'm moving away from the idea that activism will bring you into this enlightenment of seeing yourself and seeing others, because all we know, because if we're human and humanness is mimicking, even within activist spaces, violence continues to be mimicked. And I don't know that empathy will provide us, freedoms. I don't know that that's what collective healing will look like. So if I answer you, I just know that in states of violence continues to get mimicked even by the ones who think that they're working against violence. I think I would, even when speaking about Fanon, I think that all of Fanon's methods, even though they believe themselves to be a seeing process, they continue to violate. There will always be a hierarchy, and I don't think that they provide collective healing. I'm so interested in collective healing because I recognize collective trauma, but I don't know what gets us to a collective healing, and therefore freedom.
So I think that what makes a difference, I think it's the notion of hope. Because as Sophia says, if you live in a survival mode, it's really difficult to keep on hoping, really, really difficult. And I think that this hope is what help us to change our identity from passive to active, or more active. And I'm not saying that it's a very difficult process. It's easy to talk about it, but it's really difficult. And this is one of the reasons why we'll never get rid of violence. It will always be there. So this empathy, I'm hopeful. And I think that this empathy can be fine. Even, for example, like we all know that it helps a lot to be with people who experience similar trauma. It helps a lot to talk about it with people who are very familiar with what we are talking about, even if we belong to different countries. As long as, it does help a lot to talk about it with people who understand us, because we understand each other and we hear each other. So it helps a lot to, I think, to develop, to enter into a dialogue with within this type of community, and then reach a certain self-love and reach a certain freedom. But yeah, it is very difficult. I think it mostly rely on hope. I think the notion of hope is really, really important and can really make a difference. If we believe that things can change, we are more likely to try to make a change. and become active or activist. But if we are just too desperate, which like in a survival mode is completely like it's really difficult to survive. So yeah, it's in this situation it's very difficult to be hopeful and then take action. So yeah, I don't know if I answer your question, but yeah.
Thanks, Jada, and thanks to Chinjiwe as well. I see we have a couple more questions that have come in, and also want to encourage attendees, if you would like to ask a question in person, if you could maybe just raise your hand, and once I see your hand, we'll be able to unmute you, and then you can ask your question if that's what you would prefer. But just carrying on with the questions that we have here. I think again we can open this question up to all of the panelists, or sorry, to all of the presenters. This question is from Gugu, who I think is from CSVR. It says, in a continent where trauma has been experienced by its people for centuries, do you think it is possible to break the cycles of trauma learned through generations when healing has not been prioritized? So for all panelists, if you can see that, or all presenters, we can start with Tenjue if she would like to comment on that.
Okay, I'll try, but I think I may repeat myself. I think I would personally, so I think the field of violence studies is such a massive field that keeps on growing. And violence itself is so old a system that's been going, that I would definitely be interested in seeing alongside violence studies, healing studies, because the parameters in which we work is that, so why activism is that activism works within the parameters of violence. So it's this, we will fight violence with violence, and that's been going on for years, and this is what people have been studying for years. This is what Paulo Freire in part speaks to them. So I think a lot of violence studies exist over years, but I don't think that I don't even think that they've worked out in the civil society that is focused in, and by that I mean in the same way that violence studies is as big and is as massive a study. If there was to be as much funding, but I also don't think this white cis patriarchal society that the work of healing is of interest. I think that humans are disposable. I think that's what wars and what conflict teaches us. Than others, and others are more disposable than others. So I think they would need to what we're working towards. I think part of capitalism's work is to teach us that is. So yeah.
Thanks, Tenjue. I got 95% of what you said, but I think the line broke up for a few seconds at different points, but I think definitely got your message across. Jada, would you like to comment on that question?
Okay, so my answer is going to be connected with what I said just before, because I think, like, is it possible to break the cycle of trauma learned through generation when healing hasn't been prioritized? I think it all depends on our perspectives. Either we are hopeful or not, I think. I'm hopeful, and I know it's a very difficult process, and it's a very long-term process. I don't know how long, but it's a long-term process. Because it all depends on each other. It depends on everyone, and this is what makes it very difficult. We can't convince everyone, and we all have different perspectives, and we all have different needs, so it makes it very difficult. But I think we have to stay hopeful. Despite all the violence that we still see today, we also see better. We also see like some good change. So, and change has to happen step by step anyway. We can't change from from a historical trauma deepen, like, which is very deep in a community, from a healing, from like loving social interactions everywhere. I mean, it will never happen like this, but I'm hopeful, and I think we can all make a difference in this way and try to make things better. And that's the only way we can really make things better, by thinking that. I don't know if I answered, but yeah, this is my perspective.
Thanks, Jada. And I think the next question that we have, I see Bonolo is trying to rejoin us, and once she rejoins us, we'll be able to include it in the questions and answers. I'm also just checking through the attendees to make sure there are no hands raised, and at this point there are no hands up there.
Right. Sorry, I don't know where to raise my hand. I do apologize. I just like,
Okay.
I just wanted to, yeah, so just having some thoughts on, Tanjiwe and Jada responding to this question. I think what's coming up for me is just a sense that it is a complex situation. I mean, we're talking about years of violence. We're talking about this, just like Tanjiwe had spoken about, is this passing on of violence and trauma through words, through memory, storytelling, even in people's activist roles, in people's resistance, and the various messages. And I think my thoughts around looking at, healing and collective healing, I just feel like, sure, that it's such a big one. Going back to the other webinar where Nomfudu spoke about wounded leaders. And so I'm thinking about that, and I'm thinking about Jada's presentation around honest conversations, around empathy. And I know it's something that Professor Pumla Gobodo Madikizele also speaks about in terms of healing and forgiveness. But it's a difficult one. And I think that in my sense, it's not simple. I think that it's part of the honest conversations. It's part of the empathy aspect. But then what happens to all the other parts? What happens to the violence that was inflicted on individuals? What happens to the structural violence that still affects individuals today? What happens to the losses that has happened over time? We speak about loss of land, we're speaking about loss of life. And it goes also, I think, to Bonolo's presentation with the othering. And I think for me, it's just so complex. So I don't know if I'm making sense, but it's complex. And I think that, interventions itself have struggled over time with looking around collective healing because of the complexities. And I mean, we speak about holistic healing and so forth, but it really is complex. That yes, it does involve honest conversations. It involves a lot of dialogue, to bring about social integration and so forth. But then there's the other elements that, we can say government hasn't met, that the system hasn't met. And so, just one part, I feel, doesn't make the whole of the puzzle. Yeah, I just wanted to say that.
Thanks, Ma'am. I'm not sure if the presenters would like to comment on that. Okay. Thanks again, Samir. We had a question here that was from someone who was not able to join the whole presentation. But the question is saying that violence is used to gain and maintain power. And sorry, I'm just having to double check over here. Apologies, my screen has just decided to go crazy. It says violence is used to gain and maintain power. It is understood as a method of order, as stated by Chinjiwe, but also understood as a means to bring about control, be heard, and hence the research that CSVR did entitled The Smoke That Calls. But essentially, the question is asking, what are the alternatives for the collective when the system itself is violent in nature? What are the alternatives for the collective considering the system itself is violent in nature? Tanjira, maybe if you would like to go first.
Okay, sure. Yeah. I don't know. I unfortunately I don't have the solutions yet. And I think that's what I'm bringing to the table, which is we're acting in this silo of violences, and it for me it doesn't seem like there's a space for collective healing. So maybe let me say also now I think when speaking to Samaya a few years ago about this today, it was my particular interest, and because as I said, so for my PhD, I'm interested in the mimicking of masculine violences that are colonial by queer people. So I'm interested in how queer masculinities mimic a particular type of a violence. It's in the walk, it's in how you talk, and that finds itself in activist spaces. And Audre Lorde writes about this, about the honorary man syndrome, that there's a particular, Asata Shakur writes about this as well, about honorary men in movements in the United States, that even in spaces that are meant to be progressive and are meant to be bring about social change, when all that you know are these hierarchies and these structures, you mimic that. That's what the system has been teaching you to do over time. So that's why I'm interested in ideas of collective healing, because activism itself is not the end of the healing process. I think it begins processes of conversations, but the system is so rigorous in that. So I think the next question was about how short the lives of activists are. I don't necessarily think that the lives of activists are short. I think activism itself is short because it drains you so much, because it's resistance, it's fighting, it's protest, it's disrupt, and it's such a draining process that alone needs to be then followed by next step. That's what I'm interested in. Post the activism, when we see that we are working with such violences, how do we begin to enact healing when all we've ever known is to mimic violences? And so I think it speaks to the last presentation about Muslim women and the oppression amongst, so in South Africa, we know it's an oppression amongst already oppressed group. The oppressed oppress, I think, as well. So everybody looks for who is lower than them on the hierarchies of power. And one of the things that I care for the most is that it's power. It's this violence gives you a certain amount of power, and once you've gotten that power, you want to show people around you that so that's why my interest is masculinity, because masculinity connotes power. And it's that we get those crumbs from the top that we then use to oppress people at the bottom. So I would be interested in a healing where we take away all forms of power. I don't know what that looks like. I don't know how we would scratch gender and the binary and colonial borders. But I think for me, it must come first from a destruction of powers. And movements through time say this a lot. Fees Fall said this. This happened in Egypt. This happened with the SARS movement. This happened with Black Lives Movements, where they go, we are a flat structured system. This happened with Biko and the collective of Black consciousness, where people go, we are a flat movement. But as power keeps getting shared, as people get platforms, you realize that all power corrupts. So I don't know how to deconstruct power towards a collective healing. I just know that if we're still functioning within violence, we will mimic violence. So I don't know, and that I'd like other people to help me with this. How do we work towards collective healing? Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Tanjua. Thanks for those contributions. I wanted to just check if Benola is back. Yes, I see Benola is back. There were a couple of questions for Benola that I have noticed here. Section, it says, good afternoon. Perspective, is there Muslim religion influential in the way that Malis are treating each other? You get me? Okay, Banola, in the kind of between Somali that's influencing their interaction. And the second part is, what do you think is how can we change those actions? Nolo's quite bad, and she does apologize for that. Maybe just a few more questions. Let me double check that we have any hands that are raised. No other hands that are raised here. You guys can just give me 1 second. Fortunately, questions have been coming in from different spaces, and let me see this one here. Yeah, maybe Jada, I'm not sure for yourself and for Tenjue. Maybe we can comment on the points that have been raised for Bonolo. Is what do you think might be solutions to address some of the kind of discrimination, some of the interactions that she noted in her research? What might your suggestions be?
Stephen,
you're back.
yes, can you hear
Okay,
me?
great. Yes,
Okay, my apologies for that as we maneuver our way into the technological era. Sorry. So just to answer that question, I think it is complex, and I think Samia touched on this, and I think that was quite an appropriate answer. I don't think that there is one solution, but what I've noticed and throughout the research, what keeps coming up is that there's some kind of denialism that the racial tensions, specifically in the Mayfair area, exist. You know, so the questions and even how I approached the research was very targeted to that, because there was initially some resistance to speak about race, and there was, you know, a kind of facade that I sensed that the participants were putting on to say, but everything's fine and we are really united. So I think that's the first point of contact. And this was mentioned before, is around the honest dialogue and really not being okay and comfortable with these kinds of conversations, because they are really difficult to have, but they have such implications for people's lives and how it is that they, you know, occupy space. So, you know, that was one pertinent thing that I recognized throughout this process. I know you had other questions. Sorry, I didn't hear them.
No problem. Thanks, Ronaldo. I think you addressed both questions that were addressed to you. Jatin, admin, I'm not sure if you could assist. We do have a hand raised by Nokwazi. Unfortunately, on my end, I'm not able to unmute her. For unmute Nokwazi, could you please assist with that? Okay.
Thank you, Stephen. How are you?
Good yourself, Cindy.
I'm good. So my question is for Tenjiwe. At the point of saying activism is actually what is short-lived, and I'm wondering that perhaps this process, and she describes it very well in sense of saying activism is a process of many many actions that take place. And I'm wondering that is it possible that healing can't take place until the process of activism is complete, and that it goes and passes on to the next and to the next until whatever initiated that process in the first place is then finished, regardless of the generation. And then it will then come to a point where then people begin to stop and question. Can we not look at it from a development perspective, from a growth perspective, to say it has to reach a certain point before it can develop into another form of energy or another form of way of being. I don't know if I made sense.
Hi, Nogwazi. Absolutely, yes, you make sense. And I want to agree. And I want to say that in many activisms we have seen, we see how in the 60s, Black feminism, for example, in movements and in activisms across the world was not as progressive and as popular as it is now. We see that and so especially in the global. And so yes, activism can be looked at in that stretch. Part of my concern with what violence does is that the system does not wait for the activists to get there. So as you mimic, as you grow, as you change, so do the violences with you. And so if particularly we're speaking about state violences and bigger violences, they're also probably surveying, they have, so I in my summary, I also speak about the amount of power they have. They have access to continue to suppress over and over. It's, yes, we could do that, and that could be a part of the process, but as the system continues to have more systems to violate you. So in my internet connection is giving us a problem, so please let me know if you can't hear me. But it is definitely progress that in 1976 people were being shot with live bullets and dying. And in 2015, depending on where you are, people are being shot with. But what then for me it means is that there is still that carry trauma. Even in the posters that the students were saying is, we remember, we are the children of the killed in Marikana. So yes, we can keep moving on with this frame, but we are continuing to constantly carry trauma, because I don't think that hand in hand with activism is always healing. But also some of my reservations so why I quoted also in my presentation the statement, which was a big placard by a FISMA school student quoting Haiti 1804. It's the first slave revolt happened in 1804, and this is always my sort of thinking through about activism and slow progressions. First slave revolt in the diaspora was in 1804, and in between that, we have had your Du Bois rights, your Fanon's rights, we've had civil rights movements in the Americas, and then the end of colonialism in Africa in the 80s, 70s. I don't know how long then it will take for the activisms to change an entire system. And if that is the intention of activism, which is to bring about a social order, I don't know whether the violence will wait for us to get to that point. I just know that there will be a building up of traumas over and over again. And we can say, yes, we are not being shot with bullets now, and that is a victory. But we still carry with that the trauma of what that means over and over again. So I'm not against activism. My concern is that within, it's that it functions within such a violent system that is so powerful, that just keeps working faster than we do. I don't know whether activism provides place for healing, and that's my interest right now. So I don't know if that makes sense. Thank you.
Thanks, Sanjira. Thank you for that contribution. We did have a question from one of the panelists. Amina, would you like to ask your question or say your comment?
Hey, Steve. Okay, so this question is directed towards Bonolo in terms of her research, and just asking about the discussions or inputs that the Somali women had about religion. And, thinking about how, whilst religion may aim to heal and promote love and peace, there's something about how unforgiving the practice of religion can be. So how did that come out in your research?
Thank you for your question. So religion was actually, apart from what we know, which is that faith can really be, a kind of tool and a protective factor, what the participants did mention indirectly is that it really is linked to patriarchy and systems of oppression. And they found that, so when they spoke about experiences, particularly in their home countries before coming to South Africa or fleeing to South Africa, they spoke about how the laws in Somalia started to change. So one participant spoke about how, at first, before the civil war occurred, there was freedom in movement and women's bodies were not being surveilled. But after years, when the new regime kind of integrated into the country, there was so much of surveillance around what women were wearing. You had to wear really hot, warm socks in the middle of, the heat summer period. And they spoke about how religion progressively just became more and more oppressive and how they could not vocalize certain things. And in fact, before the interviews took place, initially I had a male translator and had to then switch and find somebody within the community who could act as, a female translator, because there was a strong sense from the women that they were uncomfortable with vocalizing certain things because of those dynamics that come from religion and patriarchy and sort of this invasion where women feel trapped. And that's what some of the women expressed, a feeling of trappedness, but also a need to protect their religion as well. So to not speak ill necessarily of the religion. So there was a lot of complexity in, the aspect of religion in that conversation.
Thanks, Vanola. Thanks for your contributions. I see Ruby Patel has a question that you'd like to ask. Admin, if you can just assist with unmuting Ruby. Hi, Ruby. Ruby has been muted again.
Can I be heard now? Yes.
Yes.
Okay. My question is specifically for Tenjiwe. Tenjiwe, if I can engage you just for a few seconds, and I'm going to talk very specifically from the FEES Fall perspective, which I felt was a very, very brutal time for the students and was very brutally squashed. And I suppose what I'm thinking is, as you talk about activism, is that I wonder if when we're so brutalized and we face such a brutal defeat like we did at FEES 4, that we deal with political defeat by saying that our political activities may seem useless. And I just wanted to hear what you thought of that. Thank you.
Thanks, Ruby. Julia, are you still with us? Unfortunately, we do seem to be having network problems, and Tanjua did mention the network problems that she's having. So Ruby, I think unfortunately we will have to keep your question in mind, and we will wait for Tanjua to join us again. But on my end, in kind of seeing that we have 15 minutes left, I do see Tanjua is back. Tanjua, can you hear us?
Yes, I can. I just didn't hear the whole of Ruby's question.
Okay. Ruby, could you ask your question again, please?
Yes. Hi, Tanjua. Yeah, I said I just wanted to hear your view and your opinion on on that very difficult time during Feesmas 4, when it was so brutal and we were all brutalized in such a terrible way. And I was just wondering if how we deal with political defeat, and particularly defeat that's so brutal in nature, by saying that the activism that we engage in, or the political activism that we engage in, becomes somewhat of a useless exercise. I just wondered what you thought of that.
Sorry, I realized I've been unmuted that whole time. Sure. So this, it says my connection is unstable. But so this is part of my, this comes from directly from the what Feesmas 4 was. I don't, and my intention is not at all to say that activism is useless. I think, like I've said, activism is very useful in terms of how far we have gotten with everything. Even there was a year where there was a 0% fee increase in South African universities, and that was a victory. We spoke about outsourcing and insourcing in South African universities, and from UCT to Rhodes University to Wits University, that was definitely useful, and that was strides for the workers in South Africa. What my concern is given the time frame of what then that activism versus the amount of trauma that was survived by the students. So if we're using particularly Feesmas 4, where there was just thousands of students going out every day, in particular universities, if you look at UCT, where there was occupation for over a month, at Rhodes University, where there was occupation for over a month, at UKZN, the students were imprisoned, at DUT, where the students were imprisoned. There was definitely the work towards the goal, and whatever the different goals were. What we know is that we definitely have not received a free decolonial education. So the bigger goal was not reached, but there's been these little milestones towards the path of a decolonial education. The problem is that the students who are part of that movement have not since gone to, or there hasn't been a facilitation towards a collective healing. Many have fallen on the sides. Many were excluded as a part of that process. And that's exactly what the system is sort of what I'm on. The system works on that many will fall on the side, many will be forgotten, many will not, the masses. And I think what was a beautiful time about student protest was there was a time when there were the masses, and then there were the leaders, and there were this, that. And so many have fallen through those cracks. And we know this from 76. We know this from all uprisings that have happened, that there are those who are able to continue, and they are in places where they can make really important decisions and they can implement change, but because there wasn't a work of a collective healing, what those students will do a couple of years later is if there's another uprising, they will remember what it felt like to have been hurt at that time. And so, for example, as a student who was part of Feesmas 4, I will remember what that felt like, and I would never, if I was at a position of the academy, maybe I'll write a statement or two, but I don't see myself ever going back to the field to ever be with the police. So that's what the state use, and that's what these systems use, where you know that you are short-lived, you know that you have little resources, and because you don't have the work of healing, you regather to go back to the battlefield to gather more scars, but never heal those scars. That's my concern. And once you have experienced that type of violation and a violence, what we know from violence is that it repeats itself and it mimics itself. So we know that people there's drinking problems, there's so many things that happen in these spaces that are never healed, which, yes, we will always celebrate the other victories, but I am more interested in how do we ensure that the violence does not continue to get mimicked, because we recognize that the space is traumatic.
Thanks, Sanjiri. Thanks for your contributions, and thanks, Ruby. Thanks for posing that question. I see we have 10 minutes, or just less than 10 minutes left, and we have one hand up. I think what we can do is ask admin to just allow Trudy Henry to unmute Trudy, and we can ask her to pose her question, and then we can look at wrapping up for today.
Hi, everyone. My name is Trudy. I'm an ex-employee of CSVR. I was just listening to what's being said, and I'd like to just speak to Tenju a little bit. I completely agree with her with everything that she's been saying about the mimicking. But what I've been thinking about and trying to understand is that I'm in America now, and I've seen the Black Lives Matter movement go on, and I was part of the CSW and all the activism that goes around it. But what I don't understand is that in some countries and in some states, you find that the law is very progressive. And what happens on the ground is completely different to what the law says in terms of covering the grievances that people put across and what people go into the streets to go and protest about. Now, to Tunji, I just want to find out, are there any ideas how you could marry the gap and sort of bring the law to the ground level where some of the outbursts that are happening in different parts of the world marry up where the gap is very low? Because when you see these people shooting and dying and talking about their traumas and talking about things that happened 20 years ago, and they're still talking about them, and yet the law says something completely different. And when you read it on paper, it feels like the law is very fair, so to speak, but yet what people are talking about when they go on the street, the anger, the outbursts that you see, the mimicking of power, of trying to suppress, the touching of symbolic buildings, how do you sort of bridge the gap? Or I don't know if I'm making sense in the, I'm trying to say, how do you close the gap where what's on paper begins to speak to what's on ground? Thank you.
Okay, I don't, I don't know. And I am in this to find out from other people, how do we begin to work methods where we're healing and we're useful, and with the things that we believe in as and the things that those of us who are trying to change the world, where we see the world that we envision. How do we get to a place where those things happen? How do we end violences? How do we stop mimicking? So I honestly do not know. In South Africa, I studied, as a person, I once studied the law, and I specifically left the law because it was so removed from the realities of the people. One, it was in a language that's mostly inaccessible to a lot of people in South Africa. But what I know that has happened, and maybe this is this little glimmer of hope, because it sounds like I've made people sound like I have no hope in anything. In the little glimmers of hope is, I know of Black women collectives, many of whom have come from activist movements, many of whom no longer organize either as NGOs or anything, who simply do the work of small pockets of change where and how they are. But I don't know whether the Roman Dutch law of South Africa right now, where we're discussing issues of land, and even that is not being an issue that's resolved. And even in that argument of land, I fear for what it would look like the day that anybody in South Africa says people take the land. I don't know whether there is conversations about all the other things that activists are speaking about. In South Africa, there's a freedom charter. This is what the students of Business Law were saying. Well, there's a freedom charter which says education should be accessible to everyone, and that's not what's happening. I don't know what the gaps are. I don't know whether the law itself is a tool to that. I don't know whether the law is a master's tool, and I don't know whether that it means it will not dismantle the master's house. I know that I don't know about, I know that I don't know. I know that small pockets work better than massive collective groups. And I know that, yeah, I know that I don't know. That's the answer.
Thanks, Tanjiwe. And yeah, thanks for that honesty. And I think we all in that same space, that we all trying to figure this out, and we're all asking the questions. And in trying to offer a summary for today, asking my colleagues to help me think about it, I think we all agree that there's no definitive answer, but really today has been about getting different points of view, getting some answers, and maybe hopefully moving forward, developing new understandings, but working towards the understanding, working towards addressing what is such a complex issue. Like all social issues, they are so complicated. And just in the last couple of minutes, I just want to say thank you to everyone who's joined us today. We thank you for your time. And I just want to say thank you to the CSVR team for their assistance, and to Jatin and Mitesh, who've assisted with the admin. And please do feel free to join us for our next webinar series, which, if I'm correct, I'm scrolling down, is on the, I think it's on the 9th. Yeah, the 9th of December. My colleagues can correct me if I'm wrong. But we also hope to be sharing the presentations from today. They are on Facebook if you'd like to go through them again today. It's on CSVR's Facebook page. But we also hope to offer shorter clips, discussion points that we can use to continue this conversation. Lastly, I just want to say thanks so much to our presenters, to Tanjiwe, Jada, and to Bonolo. Thanks for your time, and thanks for posing the questions that you did, and for getting us to really think today. If any of my colleagues have any final contributions, you're welcome to step in. From my side, I'd just like to say thanks again, and please stay safe.
Thanks, everyone. Just from my side, very interesting presentations, very thought-provoking. Yeah, I think it's really made me think about a lot, and really in terms of just kind of what does the work look like when we thinking about collective healing. I know that we've spoken about not having the answers, and I feel just as baffled as the rest of you. But yeah, it's got me thinking around what could that possibly look like. So thank you.